Welcome to another episode of Mysteries Unknown. In tonight's podcast, I've got Chester with me. And Chester had one of the most incredible, scariest, up-close Class A encounters with Bigfoot that I personally have ever heard when he was just a kid in West Virginia. The story is very scary. It will absolutely give you chills and keep you up at night. You do not want to miss it, so make sure to stay for the whole podcast. But before I jump into that, I want to say thank you so much. I'm blessed you guys are here. I appreciate the support and the community that we're building. But let's just jump right into the story. Chester, welcome to the show.
Hey, I'm glad to be here, and it is just an honor and a privilege to meet you and meet your followers finally, and to be able to share my story.
Man, I'm really glad you're here. I know my audience is excited to hear your encounter. I know this is really hard for you to talk about, but why don't you take us back to 1988 when you had this encounter with Bigfoot?
All right, so I'm a backwoods West Virginia hillbilly, and I was born in 1975 in Man, West Virginia, in the backwoods. And we always hunted, fished, everything. And then whenever life had a thing that come up, we eventually moved to Kanawha City, West Virginia, and it was at 57th Street. Well, me being a backwoods hillbilly and enjoying hunting and fishing and everything, and I always varmint hunted, you know, with homemade bows or the fiberglass bear bows whenever I'd pick one up at a yard sale until it'd break, and homemade arrows, and I would go out rabbit and squirrel hunting, and I just enjoyed the woods and mountains. I spent a lot of time out there, a lot more time than most people. I mean, that was my life because my life at home wasn't that good. Unfortunately, my dad was an alcoholic and he was very abusive. So the more time I spent out in the woods and mountains, the better off I would be. And, you know, me being 11, 12 years old, my parents at that time, you know, it was normal to let your kids hang out in the woods and mountains and camp out and go fishing and hang out at night. As long as you were home for supper and you had a good excuse to go back out, you were good. Well, when I moved up off of 57th Street in Kanawha City, behind the Kanawha Mall, which is long since gone, I noticed something different. Nobody had hunting dogs. Nobody hunted, and we're talking a hillbilly community. Nobody went out hunting. Nobody was out after dark. The kids had to be home before the streetlights came on, have dinner, and by the time streetlights come on, they had baths or showers or whatever, and they were in bed. Since I didn't have people that wanted to do it with me, I just did it on my own. And I explored those mountains, hollers, and logging roads by myself all the time. And I found abandoned houses halfway up the mountain, like my papa's house was that he had built because he was an old West Virginia coal miner. Well, I'd gone many miles back up in the mountains, and I'm up there and I'm building shelters and camps and camping out because I don't like being at home. Needless to say, my shelters and camps started getting tore up. Well, that kind of made me mad. I went up there and I thought, all right, I'm going to rebuild my shelter. I'm going to mark it as my territory. So I took a leak on several trees and I did it up as high as I could take a leak. And I even thought it was funny. And it was a huge mistake. And thinking back on it, it almost cost me my life. I peed on several trees as high as I could, 7-8 feet high in the area, and I held back and I did quite a few trees, and I thought it was funny, and I giggled and I snickered when I did it. It was the wrong thing to do. And this is early August 1988. I know this date because it had been my birthday and I had received a cheap survival knife, and it'd been a couple of days, and I decided I was going to go up there and go fishing with my little fishing kit in there and see if I can catch something. So I hiked back up after I'd urinated on all these trees, and what I saw was absolutely terrifying. What I saw was every tree 6 to 7 inches thick. They were snapped off like 6, 7 feet in the air. But there was no storm in those few days. I mean, there was nothing. And when I saw that, it scared the living heck out of me. And I found me a sapling and took my little survival knife and I sharpened it into a spear to give me a little more courage. I knew it wasn't going to do that much good, but I needed something besides a survival knife to make me feel better. And I walked back out of those mountains, taking my time, head on a swivel, turning around, pointing my spear in that direction. And I could remember seeing something way off in the distance peeking out at me. I didn't know what it was. I tried my best to avoid the thought of it. I was terrified. And we're talking a 2.5 hour hike out of the back mountains of West Virginia and the far end of the Kanawha National Forest, just shaking and terrified because I made something really mad. I challenged something that I couldn't ever compete with. And as I'm coming out, the thought crossed my mind to go to my friend's house, Curtis and Keith. And I went there because it was 1.5 miles closer than my house. Because, I mean, I traveled miles to get out of those mountains away from this thing. And when I would walk, it would walk. When I'd turn around, it would duck. But it was on my tail. And I got to that logging road and I felt such a sense of relief because I had this feeling of imminent danger, like you have a dog or a pack of dogs snarling and growling at you the entire time and you don't know which was going to attack first. And that's the feeling I had. And that was for a couple of hours to get down there. I climbed down that ravine and back up and sat down at the picnic table right there by it because I knew I could see anything coming across that ravine. And there was no other place to cross. It was choked with briars and vines. It was impossible to cross. Anyway, I climbed up there and I hung out with them a little bit. They were doing yard work and I talked to them and I'd forgotten. Well, the sun went down, the lights came on, and my friends got in trouble again, and I was sent home. And when I was sent home, I remembered why I was there. And anyway, I went out to the road, and I'm walking down the road. My head's on a swivel, and I'm scared to death. I mean, I am terrified. This is some of the most fear I've been in, because I remembered, what I had done. And there was an old abandoned house right down the road from them. It was an old red brick house. It's long gone, but it was falling down. And when I got to that house, I hit this smell that I'd smelled up in the mountains before. It's rotten flesh, wet dog, and it's hard to explain this smell. But once you smell it, you're going to know it. And I got that feeling again, that feeling of imminent danger. And it felt like a pack of wild dogs around me snarling. I mean, I was tiptoeing. I was scared to death. And when I got to the other end of that house, I stopped because I felt like if I went further, I was going to die, is what I felt like. I was on guard. I was swiveling with that spear and knowing it wasn't going to do any good. And then I heard a noise in the brush beside me. And I turned and looked, and I had a street light behind me. It was a full moon night. And I saw something large in those vines and bushes. And he was moving around, and first thought it was like, okay, bear, bear, bear. Okay, back away. You're fine, bear. And then it stood up. And when it stood up, that wall that it was near was 12, 15 feet away. And that wall was 8 foot high. And when it stood up, its shoulders were even with that wall. Maybe an inch or so higher. So we're talking 9.5 feet tall or more. Its shoulders were 3.5, 4 feet wide. It was massively muscled, and it was covered in hair, not fur. This is hair, like the hair on your head. It wasn't coarse fur like a deer or a bear or a hog. This was hair. You could see daylight through its hair. That's how I knew. And it was longer on the arms than it was, the rest of it. And its face was like a cross between a gorilla or a chimp and what you would think would be a Neanderthal man. It didn't have a long muzzle. It was short. The nose was more gorilla-like. It had a pronounced brow, but it was hair. And it was dark brown going to blonde at the tips. And I stood there and I looked at this thing for several seconds, and it looked at me. And I could tell it was not happy. And it let out this screaming roar that traveled through my body. And I swear I thought if I was closer, it broke every bone in my body. It was that powerful. It took my breath away. It was so strong. But it wasn't a roar. It wasn't a scream. It was a screaming roar. It was a cross between the two. And when it did that, I involuntarily lost control of most of my body. I almost collapsed, and I dropped my spear. And the only thing I could think of was to run. And I took off down this hill that you couldn't walk down fast without falling. You couldn't ride a bicycle down without sliding. I ran down this hill as fast as I could with my life on the line. I don't know how I could physically do it, but I ran. I bet you if I was racing Usain Bolt, I'd have smoked him. I ran for my life down that hill. And I heard it crash through the brush, and then I heard 2 smacks, like it tripped, and its hands, they weren't paws, they were hands, hit the pavement, and it pushed itself up on 2 feet, and it was on my tail. I ran that half a mile down that hill, and it seemed like seconds. And when I got to the corner, I turned that corner and leaned into it like I was riding a motorcycle. And when I did, I heard it slide, and it grabbed the back of my shirt and ripped the back of my shirt off. Now, the shirt I had at that time, I'd been going to a skate shop in the mall, talking to this guy. Tony Hawk was big then, and I bought a Tony Hawk Fireball skate wheel shirt. And they were like triple layer cotton. They were really tough due to road rash, and it ripped it off my back like it was nothing. I mean, those were like the thickest cotton shirts I've ever seen, and it ripped it off my back, and I felt it yank on my neck, and I just kept running. Well, I ran for the house. I ripped open the front door. I slammed it shut, and my room was 3 walls of a glassed-in porch with like a 3-foot wall around it. The rest was glass to the roof that we had converted into my room because it was a 2-bedroom house. I had my propane heater. We hung up curtains, and I had an old wrought iron bed. And I dove under my bed, ripped my quilts under my bed, and curled up in a ball and was screaming and crying, freaking out. My dad, he was a big man. He was 6'2", 280 pounds. He ripped me off from under the bed, carried me in the living room, and threw me in a chair, slapped my face, and he said, "What's gotten into you, boy?" And I told him, "Something's chased me home. I don't know what it is." I said, "But something chased me home and almost got me." And my shirt, I took it the rest of the way off. And my mom said, "What happened to your shirt?" And I said, "It ripped my shirt off." And I stood up and I turned around, and there was fingernail marks on my back. They were widely spaced, wider than a human hand could make. They're not claw marks, they were fingernail marks. And of course, my sister's sitting there saying I was lying. You're lying. You know, me and my sister never got along. We haven't talked in 25 years now due to the way she is. But she was always against me. And she said I was a liar. And when she saw the fingernail marks on my back, she said, "Oh my God." And my dad's like, "Tell me what happened." And I started going down that something chased me home and it ripped my shirt off and it chased me to the front door. So my dad, this big Korean conflict veteran, he walked over to the window, and I'd never seen my dad afraid of anything. And he pulled open the window in the living room just a little bit and looked outside for a few seconds, and I saw a shadow go by that window. And my dad turned around, white as a sheet. I mean, this thing would have been full view of the street light that was outside across the road. He was white as a sheet, and he said, "Boy, what did you bring home to us out of those mountains?" And I said, "I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I don't know what I did." And he's like, "Okay, we're going to kill the lights. Everybody go to bed. Be quiet. We're not going to talk about this. This didn't happen." And we went to bed. And I know now the reason why my dad never called the police to try to protect us from this thing is because every time we'd move, he'd write a bunch of bad checks and he'd get felonies from them, and then we'd move and he'd hide. You know, he wasn't that good of a person. He was a dictator in that house. But when he said something, you did it. So I went back out to my glassed-in porch, unprotected, knowing that this thing could smash through the house and kill every one of us, and nobody could do anything about it. I went out there and I tried to lay down on my bed, and I guess I passed out from eventually an adrenaline rush from fear, because I remember laying in bed for a long time shaking and crying because of this. And I woke up. I don't know what time it was, but I heard something outside of the house, and I could see it moving outside of my windows. And again, 3 walls in my room were nothing but windows and curtains you could see shadows through. And I could hear it sniffing outside of my house like a bloodhound, you know, real loud. I mean, it was louder than when a deer blows. It was loud. And it was touching the windows. And I just grabbed my blankets and slithered under my bed and curled up in a ball and eventually fell asleep again or passed out. But this went on for several weeks. And of course, nobody would talk about it, you know. And by the end of August, my dad had wrote a bunch of bad checks. We were packed them in a U-Haul and we were moving. And normally when we would move, it'd be Ohio, West Virginia, stuff like that, Virginia. We moved all the way to Greer, South Carolina. We moved all the way to Greer, South Carolina because of this going on. But I remember going outside and seeing barefoot tracks in the wet grass for months before this incident occurred. And me being a stupid kid, I was thinking, well, maybe my dad walked outside barefoot, which he never did. You know, my dad always wore house shoes or boots, you know, work boots. He never walked barefoot. But I saw these barefoot footprints that this thing was following me out of the mountains for months. And I thought that maybe my dad had started walking in the yard barefoot to go get his car ready for work or something. But now I realize it wasn't true. And now I realize that people in that area knew that was there, because I'd been up other hollers down through there. And those other hollers were like houses built at the bottom of a cliff. And they'd play at night. They'd run around at night. There was nothing. But when the mountains met the houses, they didn't do that in that area. And people, you know, they weren't outside at night. They didn't have outside pets. They didn't hunt. They owned shotguns and pistols. And I'll tell you, there was an old Indian that lived on that road between myself and 57th Street. He had gray braids, and he was always sitting out on his porch smoking his pipe. And he always had a double-barrel shotgun on his porch, which at that time, we didn't own no guns. We never owned any guns except for my grandfather, my papaw, and I owned a Crossman 760 Pumpmaster BB rifle. Is all we owned. My dad refused to own guns, and so we had no way to protect ourselves. But that old Indian, I was walking by there one evening, and he looked at me and goes, "Hey, boy, come here." And he never talked to nobody. I'd lived there a year and a half. He never talked to me. I never seen him talk to nobody. I walked up there and I was like, "Yes, sir." And he goes, "You need to stay out of those mountains, boy. There's things out there you don't understand." And my papaw, he never said anything about anything in the woods or anything bad. But after he moved from Man, West Virginia to Logan, he would always tell me, "You get inside before the sun comes down. You don't go outside. You stay out of the woods or the boogers will get you." I never knew what a booger was until I found out on my own.
Well, Chester, first off, man, I really am at a loss for words. That is the most incredible, scary encounter I have ever heard. And you truly are fortunate to be here talking to our audience tonight. And I want to say thank you for being brave enough to talk about that. I know that's not an easy thing to do. And also, man, I'm sorry that you had such a horrible childhood, and, nobody deserves that. But I know there's a lot of things to unpack, but I always like to ask my guests, because it is something that affects you. How did that affect you from that point on growing up, Chester? How did that change your life?
I had nightmares for many, many years over it. When I got into like ninth grade, I went to the library and I saw a picture of one on a book. I don't remember what the book was, but I got excited. And I was like, "Oh my God, I saw a Bigfoot," because I didn't know what it was. I didn't watch TV. And I got made fun of for my whole high school years. They would call me Bigfoot. They made fun of me. And it's not an easy subject for me to talk to and just get out there. But I'm at the point in my life where I don't care. If somebody wants to make fun of me, I don't care. You don't want to know me. You don't want to get to know me. You don't want to know who I am. But it caused me a lot of trauma my whole life. And it's been really hard for me to go camping and hunting and fishing, the things that I always loved. It's been really hard for me because if I hear a noise in the woods like a stick break, I'm nervous. And at night, I don't go outside at night without something to protect me besides a spear. You know what I mean?
I don't blame you at all, Chester. These things are extremely dangerous, and a lot of people think they're friendly Harry and the Henderson, and I know we talked a little bit off air about that, and you're right, they're not. I talk to a lot of guests that have these encounters. They completely stay out of the woods, and it steals that from them because the woods are my happy place. It's where I go to pray. That's where I go to have peace and talk to God and all these things a lot of times. And if these things are there, you can no longer do that. It takes that from you. But I'm really curious to see what you think Bigfoot is. What is your opinion on that, Chester?
Well, my thoughts are, from what I've noticed back then and now, because I've done research with friends. I don't ever go out researching alone. But it's a flesh and blood creature. And by the way, I want to interject on something real quick too. I feel like if I was not a child, I feel like I wouldn't be here. If I was an adult and I didn't realize I was a child, it'd have tore me apart. I feel like it corrected me like it would a child. But I feel like they're flesh and blood creatures, and the whole thing about cloaking. I've noticed, I've been up in a deer stand, and there'll be a doe walking through, and it'll stop, and you look away, and you look back, and you can't find it until it moves again. That's the cloaking. They blend in so well that if they stop moving, then you don't see them. And People are inherently noisy in the woods. Unless you have extreme training and you take days to move 100 yards, you're easily spotted by anything in the woods. And your scent travels. I don't care who you are, your scent travels. You're easy to spot. And if I wasn't injured now, I could be out in the woods and you could try to, find me. I can hear you coming from a long ways off and avoid you. It's real easy to avoid humans. And if that's your thought, state of mind to avoid people, you could do it. I mean, there's people that have ran from the law and lived in the woods for 10, 15 years and never got caught until they did something stupid. You can hate on me if you want to, but they could quite possibly be a new species of primate that hasn't been discovered, or perhaps a descendant of Gigantopithecus that has adapted, quite possibly. But I know the one that I saw, and when I looked out my window several days after, when I didn't think it was out there, it looked me face to face. And it ducked down, its face was in mine, and it had humanoid teeth and canines. It had both. But I also believe that depending on the region you're in with them, they're different. If you see one, it'll change your life. But you want to make sure it's on the best circumstances. You don't want to do anything to draw them in or mess with their territory. If you see stick structures and all that, leave them alone. I mean, leave it alone. Because you just don't know. My feeling is they're like people. You have good and bad, and they have good days and bad days. And if you catch one on a bad day and you disturb their marking, you're going to have a problem. And I disturbed one in the wrong way, and I had a problem, and it very well could have cost me my life. And I'm very blessed to still be here and talk about it today and warn people, don't do it. Missing 411 cases could be, a guy thing. You go out there, let's take a leak on a tree. They might have done that on the wrong tree at the wrong time and met their fate.
That's some good, solid advice. And I think that these things are very territorial. I think they're they run in packs, I think. And I think like you do, as far as you meet the wrong one on the wrong day, you're going to have a really bad day. And I firmly believe that. I think they're evil. I don't think they're your friendly Harry and the Henderson like we talked about. I believe, through the things through the biblical lens, and I think they're, could possibly be the Nephilim, fallen angel. There's a lot of things, a lot of mystery to it. I'm thankful that you were brave enough to come on and share that encounter with us. There's so much to unpack, and so we're gonna have you on next week, guys. Do not miss next week's episode. We're gonna bring Chester back on here, and he's gonna talk about some more experiences and some other things, and we're gonna break down some more details with this story. I don't know about you, but man, that really gave me chills. So make sure you come back next week. I appreciate each and every one of you guys. You guys are awesome. I appreciate all the support. You guys matter, and like I always say, stay prayed up. We'll talk soon.